In 1911, Winston Churchill made a technical decision that would eventually kill millions of people and redraw the map of the world. He decided to change the fuel of the British Royal Navy from coal to oil. It sounds like a minor engineering update. But because Britain had plenty of coal and absolutely zero oil, it meant that the British Empire could no longer exist within its own borders. It had to go out and conquer the land where the oil was, and that land was the Ottoman Empire. The Navy needed fuel, so the Middle East had to burn. This is Tom from the Collapse Log exploring the rise and fall of empires, because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. We often think of the First World War as a conflict about treaties and alliances and the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo. We think of the trenches in France and the mud of the Somme, but there was another war happening at the same time. A war that had nothing to do with liberty or democracy or the rights of small nations. It was a war of corporate acquisition. It was a violent, hostile takeover of the energy resources of the Middle East. To understand why this happened, we have to step onto the deck of a battleship in 1910. At that time, the Royal Navy was the master of the seas. It was the guarantee of British safety. If the Navy failed, Britain would starve in weeks. And for 100 years, the Navy had run on coal. Coal was the perfect fuel for the British Empire because Britain was built on coal. The mines of Wales produced the best steam coal in the world. It was a strategic asset that was safe, secure, and domestic. If Britain went to war, they didn't need to ask anyone for permission to fuel their ships. They just dug it out of the ground in Cardiff. But coal had problems. It was heavy. It was dirty. And most importantly, it was slow. To refuel a coal ship, you had to stop. You had to find a port. Hundreds of men had to physically shovel tons of black rock into the bunkers. It took days. And when the ship was moving, the stokers in the engine room were working in hellish conditions, shoveling coal into the furnaces to keep the pressure up. It exhausted the crew, and it limited the top speed of the vessel. Winston Churchill had just been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. He was young, ambitious, and obsessed with the growing threat of Germany. Germany was building a massive fleet to challenge Britain. Churchill knew that in a naval battle, speed and gun caliber would decide the winner. His engineers came to him with a radical proposal. They told him that if they switched the fleet to burn oil instead of coal, they could gain a decisive advantage. Oil has twice the thermal energy of coal by weight. That meant an oil-burning ship could travel twice as far without refueling. It could refuel at sea by simply connecting a hose to a tanker, which meant the fleet could stay in the fight indefinitely. It reduced the engine room crew by half, and crucially, it allowed the ships to reach higher speeds that the Germans couldn't catch. It was a technological no-brainer. The oil ships were superior in every way, but there was a strategic nightmare lurking in the proposal. Britain produced no oil. There were no oil wells in Yorkshire. There were no gushers in Scotland. By switching to oil, Churchill was proposing to take the most important asset of the British Empire, the Royal Navy, and make it 100% dependent on a foreign resource. It was a gamble of historic proportions. Churchill famously said that to commit the Navy to oil was to take arms against a sea of troubles. But he decided that the risk of being slow was greater than the risk of running out of fuel. So he signed the order. The new class of super dreadnoughts, the Queen Elizabeth class, would be oil burners. Once the ink was dry on that order, the foreign policy of Great Britain changed overnight. Suddenly, the stability of the oil-producing regions was not just a commercial interest. It was a matter of national survival. Where was the oil? In 1911, the United States was the biggest producer, but the U.S. was a potential rival. Britain couldn't rely on them. The only other place with massive proven reserves was Persia, modern-day Iran, and the rumors of vast fields in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Persia was independent but weak. Mesopotamia was a province of the Ottoman Empire. This is where the tragedy of the Middle East begins. The Ottoman Empire had ruled the region for centuries. It was old and crumbling, often called the sick man of Europe. But as long as the Navy ran on, coal Britain was happy to prop up the sick man. They wanted a stable Ottoman Empire to act as a buffer against Russia. But once the Navy switched to oil, the Ottoman Empire became an obstacle. The Ottomans controlled the land between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. They sat on top of the suspected oil fields of Mosul and Baghdad. Even worse, the Ottomans were getting cozy with Germany. The Germans were building a massive infrastructure project called the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was designed to link the industrial heart of Germany directly to the oil wealth of the Middle East, bypassing the British Navy. Churchill and the British planners looked at this map and panicked. If Germany controlled the Ottoman oil, Britain would lose its naval supremacy. So the strategy shifted. The Ottoman Empire had to be dismantled, and the oil-bearing provinces had to be brought under direct British control. This was not a conspiracy theory. It was discussed openly in the House of Commons. In 1914, just months before the war started, Churchill made a move that cemented this policy. He convinced the British government to buy a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. This was the company that would later become BP. For the first time, the British government became a direct shareholder in an oil corporation. They didn't just want to buy the oil, they wanted to own the well. When World War I broke out in August 1914, the public was told it was about the defense of Belgium. But look at where the British troops actually went. One of the very first military operations of the entire war was not in France. It was in the Persian Gulf. Within weeks of the declaration of war, a British expeditionary force landed at Fao in Ottoman Iraq. Their objective was to secure the oil refinery at Abadan and the pipelines that brought the oil from Persia. This was the beginning of the Mesopotamian campaign. The British army pushed north towards Basra. They captured the city, but they didn't stop there. They kept pushing north towards Baghdad and Mosul. Why? Why send hundreds of thousands of men to fight in the scorching heat of the desert when the main war was in Europe? Because the geologists had told them that the really big oil fields were in the north, around Mosul. The British government was playing a double game. On one hand, they were encouraging the Arabs to rebel against the Turks. They sent officers like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia to meet with the Sharif of Mecca. They promised the Arabs a great independent kingdom. They promised them freedom from Turkish tyranny. Lawrence was a romantic. He believed the promises. He fought alongside the Arab tribesmen, blowing up trains and raiding Ottoman outposts. He told them that if they helped destroy the Ottoman Empire, they would be masters of their own house. But while Lawrence was making promises in the desert, the bureaucrats were breaking them in London. In 1916, a secret deal was signed between Britain and France. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat down with a map of the Middle East and a ruler. They drew a line across the sand. They decided that France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would get Palestine, Jordan, and southern Iraq. But there was a problem. The map didn't account for the oil in Mosul. No. Originally, Mosul was supposed to be in the French zone of influence. But as the war dragged on and the importance of oil became even more obvious, the British realized they couldn't let the French have it. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George famously said that he wanted Mosul attached to the British sphere. So at the end of the war, even after the armistice had been signed with the Ottomans, the British army kept marching. They raced north to physically occupy the city of Mosul before the peace treaty was finalized. They wanted possession on the ground. When the war ended, the Ottoman Empire was destroyed, the Sultan was deposed, the Caliphate was abolished, and the British and French arrived to collect their prize. The Arabs who had fought for their independence rode into Damascus expecting to be crowned. Instead, they found British and French generals waiting for them. They were told that there would be no Arab empire. Instead, there would be mandates. This was a polite word for colonies. The betrayal was total, but the specific betrayal of the Kurds and the people of Iraq was driven entirely by the geology of oil. Britain created the country of Iraq. They took 3 distinct Ottoman provinces, Basra in the south, which was Shia, Baghdad in the center, which was Sunni, and Mosul in the north, which was Kurdish. These 3 groups had very little in common. They had different religions, different ethnicities, and different histories, but the British stitched them together into one artificial state. Why? Because they needed the oil from Mosul in the north to be piped down to the port of Basra in the south, to be loaded onto British tankers. They needed a single political entity to secure the pipeline. So they drew lines on a map that forced these 3 groups to live together under a British-backed king. They created a country that was designed to be an oil export terminal, not a nation. This decision laid the groundwork for a century of conflict. The instability of modern Iraq, the Kurdish struggle for independence, the sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia, all of these can be traced back to the British need to unify the oil fields with the shipping ports. Winston Churchill was now the colonial secretary. He was in charge of this new empire in the Middle East. He faced immediate resistance. The people of Iraq rose up against the British occupation in 1920. It was a massive rebellion. The British public was tired of war. They didn't want to send more troops to hold down a desert province. The cost was too high. So Churchill came up with a ruthless solution. Aerial policing. Instead of using expensive soldiers on the ground, he would use the Royal Air Force to bomb rebellious villages into submission. It was cheaper. It was faster. He famously advocated for the use of chemical weapons, saying, "I am strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes." The gas wasn't necessarily lethal. Mustard gas, often it was tear gas, but the intent was clear: to rule the oil lands from the air with an iron fist. This was the quiet decay of the British moral authority. They had started the 20th century as the champions of liberal democracy. By 1920, they were bombing villages to keep the oil prices low. The Ottoman Empire was gone. The Turks retreated to Anatolia and formed the modern Republic of Turkey. But the Middle East they left behind was broken. The organic structure of the region, where trade routes and tribal loyalties determined the borders, was replaced by a grid of pipelines and artificial frontiers. The British got what they wanted. The oil flowed. The Iraq Petroleum Company was formed. Despite the name, it was owned by British, French, and American oil giants. The Iraqis got a tiny percentage of the royalties. For the next 30 years, the Royal Navy ruled the waves powered by the oil of the former Ottoman Empire. But the cost was high. By destroying the Ottoman Empire, Britain removed the roof that had sheltered the sectarian differences of the region for centuries. The Ottomans were not perfect rulers, but they had a system that managed the diversity of the Middle East. When Britain smashed that system to get at the fuel underneath, they released forces they couldn't control. They created a vacuum that was filled by dictators and extremists. And ultimately, the oil became a curse for the British Empire too. The dependency that Churchill created in 1911 never went away. In fact, it got worse. As the 20th century progressed, Britain became more and more addicted to Middle Eastern oil. It wasn't just the Navy anymore. It was the entire economy. The cars, the factories, the power plants. This addiction forced Britain to constantly intervene in the region. It led them to overthrow the democracy of Iran in 1953, when Mosaddegh tried to nationalize the oil. It led to the Suez Crisis in 1956. The decision to switch from coal to oil transformed Britain from an island nation that was self-sufficient into a global predator that was paranoid about its supply lines. It changed the definition of national security. Before 1911, national security meant defending the coast of Dover. After 1911, national security meant defending a pipeline in the desert 3,000 miles away. This is the trap of empire. As you expand your reach to secure your resources, you expand your vulnerability, you create new enemies, you create new frontiers that have to be defended. The destruction of the Ottoman Empire was not an accident of history. It was a planned demolition. It was the first major war fought for oil. And when we look at the history of the 20th and 21st centuries, we see that it was not the last. Winston Churchill is remembered as the man who stood up to Hitler, and he deserves that legacy. But we must also remember him as the man who looked at a steam engine and decided that speed was worth more than stability. He looked at the coal in Wales and said it wasn't enough. He made a choice that bound the fate of the West to the sands of the Middle East. Today, when you see the conflicts in Iraq or Syria, when you see the maps that make no sense, when you see the pipelines that are guarded by soldiers, you are looking at the legacy of that decision. You are looking at the world that was built to fuel the battleships of a navy that no longer rules the waves. The battleships are gone. They were scrapped decades ago, but the scars they left on the Middle East are still bleeding. The Ottoman Empire died so that the Royal Navy could go faster. It is a terrifying equation. But in the logic of empires, it makes perfect sense. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. Energy is civilization, but the search for energy often leads to barbarism. We like to think we drive cars. But in reality, we are driven by the needs of the fuel tank, and history is just the exhaust fumes.